Thank you, Robin, and good afternoon, good morning, and good evening, everybody. I see we have people joining from places as diverse as Panama to Switzerland, so hopefully that it's a reasonable time in your time zone. On behalf of the International Land Conservation Network, I'd like to welcome all of you colleagues and participants joining us from around the world for today's webinar on financing private land conservation in Latin America. Since, and I should say even before our founding, even over 10 years ago, the ILCN has focused on sharing innovations and expertise in conservation finance from 6 continents, so that organizations large and small can catalyze, adapt, and replicate sustainable long-term financing methods and models. Over the past decade, we've seen tremendous innovation around the globe in how private and civic land conservation practitioners are designing and implementing innovative and effective financing strategies for enduring and equitable private land conservation initiatives and efforts. And with this webinar, we hope to spur and continue the conversation and ideation around the need, the challenges, the opportunities to expand conservation finance in Latin America. And so I'm very grateful to Hernan Mladenic, ILCN's regional representative for Latin America, and Zach Hummel, who's the project leader for the ILCN's network building initiative in Latin America, for organizing this session and bringing together these great speakers who Hernan will introduce. And Hernan, I'll hand it over to you to set the stage and get us started.
Thank you, Chadney. Welcome, all of you. Good morning, good afternoon. As we started to plan this webinar a couple of months ago, we realized soon enough that it would take much more than 90 minutes presentation to deal with financing private land conservation in Latin America. So this will be a 2-part series, or maybe an additional one. But today's webinar will focus on financing for creating PPAs and aims to illustrate examples of conservation finance from the United States and explore their potential relevance and limitations in Latin America. We hope that the next one, hosted in the next several weeks, will shift focus to financing, stewardship, management, and upkeep of existing private reserves, mainly the financial sustainability of them, that in the context of Latin America are largely driven by motivated landowners and managers who want to protect the natural and cultural heritage of their land. Unfortunately, due to the last-minute schedule problems, T. Thomas, CEO at Quantified Ventures, will not be able to participate today, but our next speaker has made this presentation together with T before and will probably address some of T issues. So my next speaker is Peter Stein. He is managing director of the Lime Timber Company and leads the firm's conservation-oriented forest land investment strategies. As of 2020, Lime has raised more than $1 billion of private capital for investments in high conservation value forests in the United States and Canada. Lime's conservation advisory business assists families and companies in the design and execution of conservation transactions and has so far resulted in more than 900 acres of permanent land conservation in 12 states and the province of Quebec. He is the co-founder of the Conservation Finance Network and the International Land Conservation Network. Previously, Peter was Senior Vice President of the Trust for Public Land, where he was one of the founding staff members. He holds a BA from the University of California at Santa Cruz and a certificate in advanced environmental studies from Harvard University. So Peter, you have the floor.
Thank you, and Robin, you can share the slides. So as Hernan just mentioned, I've been doing land conservation in the US and Canada for a very long time, and I was also lucky enough 10 years ago to join a wonderful group of people in the founding and creation of the International Land Conservation Network. And notwithstanding what Hernan said, it's more like 900,000 acres of permanent land conservation, not 900 acres, but that's okay. So what I wanted to share was an example that I'll get into very quickly of a private protected area that Lime Timber, as a private investment organization, was a partner with multiple organizations to create. And this slide just shows some of the groups in the US and Canada that we work with, so that as much as possible, we always have a local or regional or national NGO partner in our transactions. And it might be a very large organization like the Nature Conservancy, or a small regional organization like the Palmer Land Trust that works in the southeast corner of the state of Colorado. We've completed more than 100 of these collaborative conservation projects around the country and in Canada, around the US and in Canada. And we have also done a number of private protected area projects where Lime Timber may be the owner of the property, but its permanent protection conservation is assured through a perpetual conservation easement, or in other cases, there might be a community-based owner or civic organization owner. And let's go to the next slide. So in the US, the idea of community forests is actually very, very old. They were begun when the United States was a colony of England, and there were town forests created as part of the practice of the UK government when it was managing the vast portions of the eastern United States. In the last 20 years, the idea has kind of gotten traction again, and Lime Timber has been involved in about a dozen of these community forests, both in New England and in the mountain states. And typically a community forest is owned by local government or a civic entity like a local land trust. The community is directly involved in the management and decision-making associated with management of the property. And the income from timber harvesting or other ecosystem service benefits are directly provided to the community. So let's go to the next slide. And one more slide. So right in the center of the map, in a pretty wild green color, is a 22,000 acre parcel that had been owned by a family for many, many, many generations. And as you can see, it was in some ways the hole in the donut, the missing piece in a large conserved landscape that actually crossed into Canada. So almost 1 million acres of conservation had taken place with that 22,000 acres with a significant amount of biodiversity value, shorefront value on Grand Lake Stream, and adjacency with existing protected lands, conservation lands, had been left out. Those families decided not to own it any longer. We, meaning Lime Timber, was invited by the regional land trust down East Lakes Land Trust to participate in a competitive process to acquire it. So we were bidding against other potential buyers. We were recruited because of our history of collaborating and delivering conservation outcomes, and we were successful in acquiring the property. But what I'd like to now take apart is the role that different partners played in this particular project. So the Down East Lakes Land Trust was the community forest catalyst. They already had acquired land in dark green as a community forest, so this was an addition to an existing community forest, and they raised private philanthropic support for both the acquisition and the management of this property. The state of Maine, so state government has something in Maine called the Land for Maine Futures Fund. That's a state funding program. Comes out of a mixture of legislative appropriations and bonds and a little bit of the lottery proceeds in the state of Maine, and they were a partner. At the federal level, the U.S. Forest Service has a forest legacy program, which pays for working forest conservation easements, or a portion of that, up to 75% of the cost can be paid for by that federal program, and they were a partner as well. The California compliance carbon market, believe it or not, was a partner here in that the existing community forest was managed timberland. They extended the rotations and reduced some of the timber harvesting to qualify for a carbon project. And the proceeds from that carbon project and a carbon project on the 22,000 acres came together as both a financing resource and a stewardship resource. The Sweetwater Trust was a foundation that cared very much about wild, never touch, no touch, pure biodiversity elements of this project. And they made a grant that permanently preserved a 3,000 acre wetland component on this property. The Open Space Institute, a regional nonprofit, had money from a couple of foundations that were re-granted to this project. And then the next two groups, the Northern Forest Center and Coastal Enterprises, Inc., allowed this project to benefit from a federal income tax credit scheme as long as the investment was made in a relatively low wealth community, which was the case here. It could access federal income tax credits. I won't go into how complicated that is. Just trust me, it's very complicated, but it was really critical to the financial success of this project. And then the local government, the town of Grand Lake Stream, which is a town of a total of 300 people, appropriated money for this as well. So I wanted to share that just to show how the layer cake of financing and funding can come together to create a private protected area. The carbon project was important in at least two ways. One was the carbon project on the existing community forest supported the acquisition for the additional land that went into community forest ownership, and the annual carbon revenues are used for stewardship of the property. So this is not avoided deforestation. These are improved forest management carbon credits. So it requires definite additionality, meaning managing the forest for sort of typical management schemes have to be reduced or changed to demonstrate added carbon sink, added carbon sequestration by that forest, and it is verified through the California compliance market. So let's go back to the previous slide. So I just want to make sure that that it's clear that this was in some ways both a conservation project and a rural community development project. There are jobs in the woods. There's a recreational economy that has to do with fishing and hunting in this geography, creating more permanent conservation land, a larger private protected area, created more amenities, more area for that economy. And I don't know how often this happens, but this property landlocked that small town, the town of Grand Lake Stream. And for the previous 6 generations that the family who sold the property owned it, they would never allow any growth by the town. So by design, in conversations with the town, we left 170 acres out of the conservation easement, so there would be room for additional settlement, workforce housing, some light industrial development as well. So I think I'm going to stop there and give it back to Hernan to introduce the next panelist.
Hernan, you are muted.
Thank you, Peter. Thank you. Yeah, if people want to make questions, they can use the questions and answers, or there's no open space for do that.
Yes, they can use the Q&A function.
Okay,
Be in the
so
bottom
I
of the top
mean,
of your screen.
the idea is that after, we'll have 30 minutes for a dialogue with the panelists and questions and answers. So my next panelist is Beto Mesquita from Brazil. He's a forest engineer with a master's and PhD in voluntary private conservation in Latin America and Brazil. He has 30 years of experience in civil society organizations, holding leadership positions in national and international institutions. Currently, he is Director of Forests and Public Policies at BV Rio, which is the Green Environmental Exchange of Rio de Janeiro, aimed to develop market mechanisms, economic tools, and implementation of environmental initiatives in different countries and regions worldwide. He is president of the Ciclos Institute for Sustainability and Citizenship, of which he is co-founder. He is author of 3 books and dozens of chapters and articles on private reserves, restoration, and related topics. He's a collaborator and advisor to the National Confederation of Private Reserves of Brazil, which today hosts about 900,000 hectares of private land conservation. And since 2001, he has participated in networks and associations of private reserves in Latin America. So, Beto, please, your presentation.
Thank you, Hernan, and thank you everyone from the International Land Conservation Network for this opportunity. Good afternoon, good morning, good evening. Maybe we have some people in the evening at this time. Thank you for this invitation. I would like to share some aspects related to the conservation, the challenge to financing private land conservation in Latin America, but some specific examples from Brazil and more specific issues that here in BVRio we are engaged and to try to implement. Thanks, Robin, to share these slides. And next one, please. First, I think that would be better that we put everyone just back one place. That's it. That's it. Thank you. Just to put everyone in the same page, because we are talking about privately protected areas. We are talking about PPAs, which are the acronyms of privately protected areas. But what exactly is privately protected areas? So I decided to start my speech sharing this definition come from the IUCN, because I think this is very important that we can put different types of conservation in private lands. And it is related to the different opportunities, as Peter showed us previously, in terms of the opportunities for financing private conservation in private lands. So PPAs, this is a specific words that I would like to emphasize. Robin, the next one, please. It's an area, it's a protected area as the definition in IUCN, managed under private governance. IUCN categorized protected areas in different types of management categories related to the main objectives in terms of conservation, in terms of management of those protected areas, and classify, for the other hand, in complementary classification as who are in charge of the management of those areas. So privately protected areas are protected areas as defined by IUCN, managed by under a private governance. And what is exactly? It's a places, specific place defined is its geographic territory where the main focus is protection of biodiversity, its protection nature. We can engage we can implement different activities, but always as a protected area, the main issue will be the conservation. Sometimes when other activities or other purpose or other ideas or even other opportunities to financing the activities implemented in this area is still in conflicts with conservation, conservation will be the priority in this case. So next one, Robin, please. And then I would like to put two different perspectives from the financing of funds comes through conservation on private lands. First of all, funds increasing conservation. Funds financing results in that makes possible that we implement a privately protected area. And here we're talking about the voluntary. As RPPNs in Brazil, the voluntary, they are created by a voluntary decision from the landowner, and financing makes possible we have a decision, but you need an opportunity, you need a way, we need a means that we can achieve this decision, these dreams in some case. This is an opportunity for privately protected areas as themselves. Next one. Funds would be helping to avoiding deforestation. In some place, as here in Brazil, as I show you in the next slides, we have privately protected area. So protected area managed by landowners, private landowners, but it's not voluntary. It's created by a law. We have a forest code, and our forest code implies the compliance with forest codes implies that we must to protect, to keep as a native vegetation a part of each property in Brazil. This is a mandatory, and sometimes the financing could be the reason why a protected area are implemented. But in other way, sometimes financing will be promoting conservation on private lands. And here I would like to emphasize that PPAs are an example, and maybe the strong example of conservation on private lands, but it's not the unique tool, the unique opportunity. We can implement different strategies to promote conservation on private lands beyond privately protected areas. And this is some opportunities, and the difference of this in terms of the financing, I would like to emphasize. Next one, please, Robbie. So, as I said, in Brazil, our forest code, which is created in the 1934, the second version in the 1975, and now the current version of the forest code was implemented in 2012. And then in Amazonia region, at least 80% of each property must to keep in the native forest. In the Cerrado, our savanna biome, in the center of the country, the areas with forest in the Cerrado biome, but included in a region that we call it as legal Amazonia, at least 35%. In the rest of the country, 20%. So each property, rural property in Brazil must to keep at least 20% of this total area under native protection. Next one. And then the same law, the forest code, established a quota, we call it as a CRA, as environmental reserve credits. It's an opportunity, it's a market mechanism predicted in the law that we can create offset markets among farms that has less than the legal reserve, the minimum of the legal reserve area, establish agreements with farms that is surplus, that is more than the minimal requirements, and they can change most of the times in a commercial way, in a privately agreements that includes transference of money, but sometimes that includes different types of benefits. In this case, CRAS also can be used as an offset, but also can have used it to implement, to finance new protected areas. Because sometimes if we establish an agreement forever, in perpetuity, or even that establish an agreement, for example, 13 years, 14 years, we will implement, and the landowner who's benefit from this opportunity will pay for another one to keep those other area as a protection under the protection activities, and could be a different way of conservation of private lands. Regarding this opportunity predicted in the law, we developed a program here in Brazil. Next one, Robin, please. We developed CFLOR, which is a program to support the implementation of the forest code in Brazil. What is this? We are providing funds for private landowners, specifically in Brazilian Amazonia, in legal Amazonia, which includes 9 states and about 56% of the entire the area of the Brazil. And then we are offering an average, it's not exactly this amount, but it's an average about $60 per hectare per year in agreements during at least 13 years. The part of those financing come from the opportunities in the voluntary carbon markets. But here, in this case, we have bad news and good news. Good news, we already leverage, we raise about $200 million to invest in this it's a kind of a payment for environmental services program. We already raised it $200 million. This is the good news. Bad news, after 2 years implementing this program, we already analyzed about 250 properties, farms, to check the compliance with the program, the compliance with the forest code, if they have more than 80% of the area. And until now, 2 years after we started the program, we just achieved 4 agreements. So we have a challenge here in terms of the land tenure issues. It's a nightmare in Amazonia, in Brazilian Amazonia, to have the insurance in terms of the land tenure issues. You have a lot of problems with land grabbers, with different types of overlap on the indigenous lands, for example, or other traditional communities' lands. So we must keep very carefully in terms to choice, to select, to analyze, to do a due diligence, a right and very restricted due diligence to implement. But funds are there, opportunities are there, and here it's could be the opportunity for a privately protected area or to invest or to enhance conservation on private lands. Next one, please. Another opportunity that we are implemented with our partners in sustainable investment management, it is not for the first one, CFLOR, is only to the Amazonia region. This is only for Cerrado biome in the center of the country, where the production of soybean is increasing a lot. It's a huge increase in the last 20 years, and it's still increasing right now. The deforestation rates in Cerrado, it's highest than the Amazonia region in the last year and during this year. And here we are offering a loan, a credit for soybean producers, but set a requirement as they must to keep more than the minimum requirement in the legal reserve. And then if they comply, not only the complies with the forest code, but has more than the minimum area, we consider that it's a conservation on private land in additionality of the legal requirements. They eligible for this program. Until now, we are in it is an annual loan. We are starting the third year for this opportunity. The Responsible Commodity Facility is the name of this financial mechanism. And we expected to achieve more than 150 farms in the Cerrado and invested about $40 million for this third year on this program. And it was helping to protect more than 36,000 hectares in additionality of the area that will be protected only by the legal requirements. Next one. And then just to go into to end my first speeching, we have a lot of opportunities in carbon credits, but we have a lot of challenges in terms of eligibility, in terms of additionality. For most of the places, it's very difficult to achieve all the requirements in the methodologies, in the standards that we have in international. And right now, we are suffering a lot of criticism. It's a crisis, a credibility crisis on the voluntary carbon markets. And we must to consider that it's an opportunity, but we must to keep in very carefully in these opportunities. Here in Brazil, we have at least 56 million hectares at risk of planned deforestation. It means that it is the area surplus of the legal reserves, or more than 80% in Amazonia, 35% in Cerrado biome, in Amazonia area, and more than 20% of the other areas. 56 million hectares. So how we can address, how we can promote some kind of payment or some kind of supporting those landowners to keep those forests there and change their idea or their intention to cut those forests or to start to still deforestation in these areas. Another opportunity, next one, please. We're talking about the Brazilian government suggesting some months ago, and that now we are trying to develop in more details an idea that they put the nickname, the Tropical Forests Forever Fund. This is not related, it is I used to call this as a climate financing, but it's not related to carbon credits. Carbon credits for offset is, we must to keep very carefully, because we use this to offset, we use this to claim different commitments from private sector, for example. Here, we're talking about the sovereign carbon, we're talking about the opportunities to promote protection, to protect forests in public protected areas, but also in privately protected areas. It could be a very strong mechanism. We are in a good expectation of this opportunity. And since in the last years, just in the last years, the voluntary carbon market achieved $2 billion, this opportunity could be leveraged more than $250 billion. So, and then we are developing these opportunities. We are very interested to establish the mechanisms, to establish the tools that we can put this money from the developing countries, from the private sector, from the specific industries that they are responsible to GHG emissions, directly through with a very strong but not complex indicators that we can evaluate it in a very easy way to save trade-off costs. So the idea here is to protect forests. The idea here is to help the people who are protecting the forest landowners, indigenous communities, traditional communities, and even have publicly protected areas. So when I'm discussing about financing opportunities and funds, we have a lot of different opportunities, and we must be considering with different tools and different approaches related to conservation on private lands, as PPAs is one of them, but other approaches of conservation of private lands will be very useful and very important to complement our challenge to avoid deforestation and to increase the protection of biodiversity. I think this is all for this time, and my contacts is there. So thank you, Hernan. Thank you, ILCN staff again, and let's go move forward.
Okay, thank you, Beto, for that exciting presentation. And a lot of things to consider there. And there are some questions that we will present it to you on that is related to carbon credits, which I think it's an interesting topic for many of people who find ways of funding and financing private conservation in the region. So I will present my next speaker. Sorry. Okay. Okay, my next speaker is from Panama. Is Samuel Valdez. He is director of the Biodiversity Consultant Group, has a degree in biology from the University of Panama, with an MBA in marketing from the Inter-American University. He has more than 20 years of experience in the field of environmental management, leading and participating in numerous projects at the national and international level for public and private protected areas, as well as the nomination of World Heritage Sites. He has been a consultant for organizations such as the Ministry of the Environment of Panama, the WWF. In addition, he published several scientific articles and books on the ecology and diversity of Panamanian fauna. From 2019 to 2024, he was president of the Network of Private Natural Reserves of Panama. Samuel, you have the floor.
Thank you, Hernan. Thank you all. Thank you for this space to talk about this complex theme in Latin America. In order to guarantee a good connectivity, I will shut down my video so you can. I will shut down. So let's talk about conservation finance in Latin American context, challenge or opportunities. Next, please. This will be a very quick presentation. It's a very difficult task because the diverse nature of Latin America. Latin America is an exuberant region with a huge huge biodiversity, is a hotspot of biodiversity, but also it has a hotspot in political, cultural diversity. We have different ways to manage the land and to make conservation. Next. But it's too a part of being a huge biodiversity region with this complex nature of societies and culture and economics point of view. Latin America still is the most protected region of the world. Well, it's maybe 21% of the total protected areas it's more than the surface of Brazil and the continental territory of Brazil, combined with Argentina, Mexico, Peru, Colombia, Bolivia, and Paraguay. So we have a huge effort in conservation. And this data came from the Protected Planet Report 2020. So, but all this protection is in different governance systems. Some Most of them are from from ministry level protection, protected areas. Some are from municipalities, conservation, but others are from individual properties, from private protected areas, from companies, from indigenous communities. So this is a mix of landscape with different kind of protection. Please, the next. So, but despite this huge connectivity, this huge surface protected, 33% are not well connected, and this is key because usually states, the governments establish protected areas, but most of the time make it in the protection of the land is chosen not necessary because scientific support for the conservation, but most for cost of opportunity. Let's say less productive lands, plains lands, or critical habitats that can be more efficiently used for the country for development of cities, let's say, are less protected that complicate geography forest. So what happened is that we create islands. That's happening in Panama, happening in most countries, that we have isolated protected areas and with the lack connectivity. And this report, the Protected Planet 2, was make a measurement of the connectivity of the protected areas and concludes that we need to work on connectivity. Next, please. So there's where private and after the speak of the Beto, we have to make a difference between private conservation and private and voluntary conservation, because we learn that there is private but obligatory conservation in Brazil. So not all scenarios are the same. In some cases, individuals and companies has to protect by compromise or in a legal framework of different countries. In Panama happens too. We have to protect the sites of the rivers. So this is private conservation, but it's not voluntary. So private and voluntary conservation can enhance the connectivity of public protected areas. And this is where we go. What we are trying to find a strategy in some countries to create a stepping stone between protected areas to enhance connectivity. And this is some statistics of the surface of protected privately and voluntary protected areas in Latin America that summarize more than 4.5 million hectares. Of course, this needs to be updated, but this was the data published until 4 years ago. Next, please. So, despite all difference, voluntary conservation in Latin America has been undertaken without legal framework. In most cases, not all the case, but most cases, people, communities, families, and corporations decides to protect. But in most cases, there is no legal framework to do this. Just we protect because we want. And without clear policies or clear incentive to do that. And most of the times financed by the resources of the owners. So most times there is not an established finance platform to buy lands and to keep it protected. All the small owners, in Panama, most of the 50 owners of private and voluntary conservation areas, let's say that 90% are small owners, small pieces of land from 2 hectares to 300 hectares. And most of them buy by themselves the land. And most time making an opportunistic way. So they find a land that deserves to be protected because the individual feel the necessity of understand the importance of conservation, and in this sense, the private conservation is a very voluntary activity, well, with a genuine interest of the preserving the nature. This is most of the cases. Please, the next. But there exist some interesting examples, models for land acquisition in Latin America. There are, I know that there's a lot of examples, maybe in Colombia, on Chile even, but I want to present the case of Jocotoco, case in Ecuador, that they make it like an international cooperation and donors. And in this way, the next please, they have 16 different private protected areas chosen by with a scientific base. And most of these, or I have to say that all of these privately protected areas respond to a need of critical habitat conservation of birds. So this is a science-based critical habitat protection. And in this way, in the webpage of Jocotoco, you can find this information: 50 reserve, 33,000 hectares protected, representing more than 1,000 bird species, included in these lands, and 50 critically endangered. Next, please. I forget to back, please. Back. I forget to put a slide that most of these, the financing of these lands came from donors, and from a good strategy of Jocotoco together with BirdLife, with international organizations that support the effort, and promoting of the activities related with bird watching. This is a huge market of bird watching. So this is a good example of how to use a touristic operation specifically dedicated to bird watching to preserve and to, it's a good way to develop a model of land conservation. Well, this is an exception really, because they are really good in this. Not all Ecuadorians private protected areas work in this way, but this is a good example. Give us good ideas on how to create a financing strategy for conservation. So next, please. So what happened in Panama? We made some conservation despite the deforestation incentive. This is a really bad business, because the government, the Agriculture Development Bank of Panama offers a 0% interest rate for loans to buy land for cattle ranching, reimbursement of agrochemical acquisition, fence building, cleaning the land to create pastures. And they offer to you also some incentive, more than just 0% interest rate for establish a cattle ranching operation. And for years, this happens without any environmental consideration. Recently, I must say, that recently include the requirement of authorization to receive these loans. They need authorization from the environmental ministry to develop new cattle operations close or in protected areas. So this is something, but for years, this happens without taking in consideration where will be invested that money. So what I say, that the deforestation in Panama is financed by the state with this interest approach, with this financing incentive, to deforestation. But more than this, there's other, but this is just one example of how the government push for this. So next, please. So clearing the forest in Panama is a good business. Well, and this is was written by it's an important scientific in Panama, Dr. Stanley Hecado Moreno, write about this. Write this book From Jungles to Pastures. Well, because buying land for conservation goes against the bids, because the incentive goes against keeping the forest cover. If you clean the land, you take a loan to clean the land and make a pasture, you can sell it they have a more value than a land with forest itself. So it's a very, very bad business idea to protect forests. So in this way, there is no finance opportunities for to buy lands to protection. Next, please. Well, but despite all, let's say that I still want to buy lands to protect, and I don't care about the money to buy the lands. Well, I have the compromise. I just want to keep protecting lands. I'm a small owner. I want to keep forward. So who pays for the protection and monitoring of the biodiversity assets? So this is a long time. This should be, I'm sure that this will be the next webinar about who pays for the protection and how money we need to protect after we buy the lands, because they will not protect by themselves. Cattle ranchers, hunters, and wood people that could be treated to selling the wood. I forget the name in English. So they want to take over these resources of private protected land, but who pays for the conservation? So first, we have to identify a financial gap for conservation. But there are some good examples of financial support from Ecuador and Costa Rica to support the payment for the conservation after the establishment of the protected area, the private protected area. I briefly make a briefing about Proyecto Sociobosque. That is a good example of payment for conservation in Ecuador, and is supported by a lot of international institutions like German investment bank, local banks, and some financial support from the Ecuadorian government. The next, please. And Costa Rica also has a payment for environmental service program that is financed by, funded by a tax on fuel taxes and water concession permits, mostly, but there are other sources for to enhance, to make incentive for conservation of forests, but also for forest management. You have a different, it's a broad menu with different options to protect, including protecting water resources, including management of forests and natural regeneration, and the less, at least you receive $72 per year per hectare for forest protection. Next, please. As I said before, this is part of a law from the authority that regulates public services. And this is what I said before, is financed partially by fuel taxes, water concessions, international credits of the World Bank and private sector. And they created funds for private financing. This is a FONAFIFO that established a payment for environmental service. And now they are working in a fund for sustainable biodiversity. So there's two examples. I wish to have more time to expand more about how does it work and the results of this initiative in Latin America, but it's something to show you the difference between countries, one side to other. What what is happening in Costa Rica is absolutely different from what is happening in Panama, and different from, of course, what is happening in Colombia, Ecuador, that all have different ideas and ways, models to finance land conservation. But I think I like to think this in a huge laboratory for ideas. So, and this, I think that's what we pretend here, to hear about all these ideas and take the best and try to find a way to identify financing opportunities in Latin America. Thanks you all for your time. Thank you, Hernan. Thank you, ILCN, again for your time, and continue.
Thank you, Samuel. Well, although there are hopes in some regions and countries in Latin America, it's worrying that we still have this kind of counterproductive economic tools that are doing all the opposite of incentivizing protection, but rather the contrary. So we hope there's going to be a change of public policy in PENASA to avoid this externalities. Well, I will pass the floor to Zach Hamel, who is a graduate student from the University of Montana and who has been helping us on strengthening the Latin American network of protected areas. We've been working together in the past months, and I will ask Zach if he can help us with mentioning some of the questions that have been addressed in the questions and answers section of this webinar. Zach?
Thank you, Hernan, and thank you, everyone. Those were some great presentations. And yeah, it would be great if we can just work through some of the questions we have here so far before we bring it back to our panelists for discussion. One of the questions here is directed towards Beto, who already responded a little bit, but I'll repeat the question for everyone. Can you give more details about the SIMFLOR mechanism you mentioned? How did you collect the money? Did you have or create specific strategy to gather all that money to then have it available to dedicate to private land conservation? Beto, I leave it to you.
Well, SIMFLOR, despite that we submit a project in VERRA platform, in VERRA standard, as a carbon project related to the authorized planned deforestation, because we are focused in the surplus of legal reserves. So in the area, in those 56 million hectares that under the risk of deforestation, in despite that we are looking for this opportunity, SIMFLOR, it's not only a carbon project. The funds that we raised, it's more related to payment for environmental services in general. This is the first opportunity that we raise funds to put the CRA, the environmental reserve credit that are predicted in the forest codes, not to offset legal reserve, not to offset the deficit of legal reserve, but as a financial mechanism itself. So since when we finished the law, the first code in 2012, I think that's, well, in the law has different mechanisms to offset deficit of legal reserve. There is an environmental easement, there is a servidão, there is other opportunities, and CRA, and the environmental reserve credits. In my perspective, that's in the beginning, this, well, if the legislator create different types, this one, it's not only to use to apply to deficit, to offset, but also if I have a international fund, if I started to implement the tropical forest forever funds, and I use to support a national law that are interested to protect the area, I can put money in a kind of this mechanism with a kind of insurance. It's a kind of insurance because this is a paper, a monetized title, recognized by the government, established by the emitted by the government, issued by the government, and then the property, it's, well, keep the forest there. While you keep the forest there protected, standing, you keep this document available, and then the document go to the market as a support for protection. So this is our idea. Sinfor is more related to implement, to raise funds to be possible, pay the people who are protected beyond the legal requirements in Amazonia, and then part of the funds coming from the carbon credits, but the approach, it's going beyond the voluntary carbon market approach.
Thank you, Beto. This next one is for Peter. And Peter, the question is, what are the key enabling conditions for innovative conservation finance partnerships and transactions? How has this evolved in other countries that Latin American countries could use as a model?
Great question. And if we have about 2 hours, I can answer. No. I think there are some really, really good examples from Australia and connecting to the Australia Land Conservation Alliance, who has done a series of conservation finance gatherings, would be great. They actually developed a scoping paper about 5 years ago that is accessible, I think, through the ILCN website. That would be an interesting model. Not obviously not everything that happens in Australia is transferable to Latin America, but many of the things are. So that's one beginning. The other is to the extent that you want to do what the European Land Conservation Network has been doing for the last 2 years. They actually produce a conservation finance boot camp, and it will take place in May in Romania this year. But it brings together practitioners, experts from other parts of the world, and really allows sort of a deep dive into some of the mechanisms that Beto and Samuel shared, as well as what's going on in other parts of the world. A lot of it has to do with the readiness of NGOs. Many NGOs are not quite ready to get involved in complex financial engineering and stacking of different capital sources. So building the competency and comfort, and it's not just the staff of the NGOs, but it's their board members as well. So that's my very short answer.
Thank you, Peter. Samuel or Beto, you have some ideas of how that might apply to Latin America or to some context that you're more familiar with? Samuel, maybe I'll direct this towards you.
Sure. Well, it depends of each country. So it depends of the legal framework. Let's say the first step is to have the recognition from the governments of this initiative for protecting lands. And then after you have a legal framework, you can start to work on financing tools or or try to bring from other countries, from other initiatives. But the first of all is that you have to be recognized by the state, by the country. In Panama, this is not the case. After 3 years struggling to get a legal framework to recognize and make it not even recognize. What we just need is a register of the private and voluntary conservancy initiative in Panama. And there is not an official recognition from the governments. So this is the worst. We are in the worst case scenario. We are doing it, and even we don't have recognition from the government. But other countries, in Peru and maybe Ecuador, Colombia, and Costa Rica has a recognition of the government's recognized private conservation initiative. So this is the first step. And working on that, over that legal framework, then we can start to look for initiative for financing. I open here the document that Chutney expanding finance opportunities to support private land conservation in Australia. So I'm sure that we can find some ideas that work here.
Thank you, Samuel. This one will be for both of you, and maybe I'll start with Beto, directed toward Beto. Both of you have talked about some of the needs and opportunities of financing the creation of PPAs in your presentations, but maybe you can expand on what are the major needs and opportunities of creation of PPAs versus financing of stewardship. And we have several questions related to that in our chat. So Beto, I'll start with you. What are the needs and opportunities in financing the creation of PPAs versus financing stewardship? And if you could expand on why, that would be great.
Yeah, I think this is maybe the main issue that we have to discuss when we're talking about financing to private conservation on private lands, because, well, if you consider the IT goals, if you consider all the challenges that we have to expand to increase the protected area network, always we are making all the efforts to create new protected areas and as big as much that we can implement in protected areas. So, but when talking about privately protected areas, we must consider the costs engaged to steward the area, to protect the area, to implement all the issues. And I think that we can consider both opportunities. I believe, let me give an example. Voluntary credit carbon. All the methodologies recognized and spread in this market, it's not available to privately protected areas that already existed, because the additionality issues, the additionality requirements, and sometimes, depending the legal framework in the country, even the eligibility criteria, could be achieved by the privately protected areas that already existed. So, but for the other hand, when we in regions that we have high deforestation rates, and we have some intention or some efforts or some kind of decision to people to implement new protected areas, so we have an opportunity to financing this, and then we have the opportunity to achieve the voluntary carbon markets. To the other hand, for people, for example, for almost 2,000 REPPNs that we have in Brazil, as Hernan mentioned in the beginning, almost 1 million hectares protected by families, individuals, small organizations, small companies, and even with big companies. So they are providing environmental services for the entire society. They are providing biodiversity protection. They are contributing directly to promote nature conservation, and they don't receive anything for this. So I think that we must, unfortunately in Brazil, the endowment funds, it's not feasible as in other places. But I believe that we must consider things like CRA, for example, the credits and the financial mechanisms that we can put directly funds to the landowners, that they have a plan to protect the area, that they have a plan to steward or to implement activities that ensure the protection in the long term. So this is different types of funds for different types of objectives and management issues. Then at the same time, we can create new protected areas and take care of the protected areas that already exist, as the RPPNs in Brazil, for example.
Thank you, Beto. And one quick follow-up question, since you were talking about the carbon market from Kiragu, could one of the panelists briefly explain the preconditions of governance for community-owned lands to make access to the carbon market?
Oh, sorry, Zach, I can get, what is the issue this?
Could you briefly explain the preconditions of governance for community-owned lands to have access to the carbon market?
Well, first of all, we have to consider how can I say legitimacy? How can I say in English? Well, we have to ensure that those area it's owned by a community, and it's all the community is informed and participate in the process to decide to develop carbon credits there. Most of the times, a carbon projects, it's so complex activity that we use it a carbon projects developer, a company or an NGO who is very specialized, has a different types of expertise to develop. We need to establish a strong, confident relationship among the community, which own it or manage the area or has the rights in terms of the area. This is set in the methodology. Sometimes we're not talking about the land tenure. We're talking about the governance. We're talking about the rights to use these areas. So if we have a community in a place, but the good opportunity to establish a strong partnership with a carbon developer, but keep very carefully in terms of all the community must to be informed, the community must to be confident, the community must be participate, and in the terms of the sharing, the benefit sharing, the community must be the most important stakeholder in the when we decided how share the benefits and the co-benefits, the financial benefits and the co-benefits from the carbon credits. I don't know if that achieved all if I got the right sense of the question.
Yeah, I think you addressed quite a bit of it, but though it's of course an extremely complex issue.
Yeah.
Samuel, this next one is for you. You were talking about Hocotoco in Ecuador, and we have a question from Mark Thurber, who is also living in Ecuador. He says, a persistent problem in Ecuador is sustainability of private reserves. Many reserves have simply been sold off after the landholder is out of the picture. Can the panelists expand on sustainability strategies for foundations with landholdings in terms of setting up BOD structures and long-term financial instruments, both within Latin American country where the conservation area is located and within countries where donors are located?
Sure. Thank you, Zach. Thank you. Well, there's a common situation mainly for small private owners of lands. We have been exploring some ideas. The first one is to create a land trust to buy or to incorporate into this land trust the lands that properties the owners cannot keep more by themselves. If people cannot support them by different issues, maybe sometimes it's a chronological situation. People get old and the owners simply cannot keep sustaining more of the land and they want to sell it. One option should be the establishment of a land trust to buy the lands and keep the protection, let's say, in a more long time. Ideally in a perpetual time, so keep it protected forever. Because most of the times it depends of the willing of the owner. Well, this is some ideas, some examples of land trust that both need financing. That's the first. We go back again to the financing, how to get the money to buy the lands and protect it and create this land trust. And also some ideas will be to establishment of a fund. So the interest of these funds work to payment for conservation. And also I want to talk something about the credit carbon. We we need to move far away from carbons, because we are, for us, in terms of carbon credits, it's not feasible for most of us, because we barely create new carbon credits. We prevent them from releasing. So in general terms, the RED Plus should be one idea that is working in some countries like Colombia or Ecuador, because the huge surface, maybe Chile too. But for most small owners, it's not a solution. So, but there exists other initiatives related more than just the carbon. It's to value the biodiversity, the biodiversity assets and the ecosystem services and goods generated by the forest. So I thought that we can move away from just carbon and start thinking on biodiversity banking, for example, and trying to figure out some ideas from this initiative in Europe and USA related to biodiversity banking, to protection of forests, more than just thinking on carbon credits. That is okay for some initiative, but for us, that we keep the forest, not just the carbon of the forest, all the biodiversity assets, the regulatory services of the forest, in terms of water production, in terms of climate change adaptation and mitigation. The forest works more than a sink of carbon. We protect more than that. So we must start thinking more than carbon.
And to follow up on that idea, Samuel, could you expand on some of those opportunities that are emerging beyond the carbon markets, maybe in Panama or elsewhere, whether that be biodiversity credits or climate credits?
Sure. One idea, the idea behind this is that we are protecting biodiversity active. Like in terms of economical or financing thinking, we have assets or capitals, and we have passive. We have losses. We have credit, and we have a passive. So when we create and we protect biodiversity, we create active. We create a biodiversity assets. When we cut the trees to create a new urbanization and a new project, we lost. So the idea is you have to compensate the losses with the gains. So if we gain surface in terms of biodiversity, we are creating an asset that has a value. And if you create you create losings by developing of cattle ranching, let's say, you have to compensate for who is creating value. So this is the behind the idea behind the biodiversity banking. So if we can make a regulation, we can create an institution, an organization that keeps track of the biodiversity assets in one hand, who is creating biodiversity values, who is preserving biodiversity values and ecosystem service values, and who is creating a loss of biodiversity values. So who create the loss have to compensate to create the balance. So it's a market terms, it's a very capital way of thinking, the values and so this is the idea behind. I know that there are some examples. I'm trying to present the idea in Panama to some companies that generate these losses of biodiversity and how to manage. But there's a question from Mimi Foley from where USA have good examples of biodiversity banking, and some private companies also work on that, specifically because there are some, and talking about financing, there exists some conditions for financing infrastructure and projects in the world by the FEC. Have a compromise to create net positive impact on biodiversity when the project is developed in critical habitats. So there's agreement that there is not enough with the typical mitigation and mitigation of impacts. So companies and banks are moving forward to not just mitigation and minimization of impacts is not enough. We have to create a positive net impact. Leave the things better than we receive it. So here's where the biodiversity banking gets in. We preserve biodiversity assets. Who have to pay for it is who create the losses.
Thank you, Samuel. And looking at the time here, we'll have one more question. This is for Beto. And I want to highlight to our viewers, there are a lot of questions in the chat about financing stewardship activities. And I want to highlight that our follow-up webinar in several weeks will specifically be about financial sustainability. So please stay tuned in about that future opportunity. For now, I want to move on to the idea of networking. And for our viewers who aren't aware, the ILCN is active in supporting a Latin American regional voluntary land conservation network. Beto and Samuel are very active partners in that. And this question is for Beto, and it is, what might be the first steps that a Latin American network can take to expand conservation finance opportunities in Latin America?
I think the first step will be to identify the right partners, because we spend the last 1 hour and a half just to emphasize there are a diverse. We are a lot of diversity in terms of the experiences, in terms of the achievements, in terms of the profile, in terms of the goals, in terms of for legal framework for each country. So I don't believe that one mechanisms or one strategy, the same strategy for the Latin America, maybe would be very difficult. We must to understand, as we must to design a strategy considering those diversity, considering the challenges, the different challenges. And I think that in some case, for example, the examples of Green Development Bank, in my perspective, I think that opportunities as the Tropical Forests Forever Funds could be an umbrella to different types of financing strategies. I prefer to think that the network will help to design 2 or 3, maybe in a platform of investments, but 2 or 3 or 4 or 5 different approaches or different products for investments, considering grants, considering endowments, considering different opportunities for transfer for sovereign carbon. I think that the first step is to identify the right partners to develop the strategy, to understand the challenges, and to develop the right strategies. Who sometimes the people said, well, if someone has a easy answer for a complex questions, they don't know about the complex of this question. So I think that we must to identify the right partners to move forward on this.
Thank you, Beto. And Hernan, I will leave it to you to close us out. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, Zach. Thank you. We have the time to address many of the questions, although as we began this, when we begin this webinar, we said that this is a long conversation that will not be covered by just one webinar. So the plan is, as just recently Zach mentioned, is to have a second part webinar on conservation finance, but address into the sustainability and stewardship and management, and how we can financially sustain those reserves, and especially those small owners that are struggling, every year to maintain and to keep that property alive. So, well, we are over 70 participants that lasted until this moment, and we're grateful for all of you, for the panelists, with those excellent presentations. In the following weeks, we're going to have a second webinar where we can address, all these other issues that maybe we didn't have the time to address fully here. So thank you very much, Samuel, Peter, that have to leave us earlier, and Zach, and all the people from all over that were present here in this webinar. So thank you very much, and I hope to see you in the next webinar. And I invite you all to visit the ILCN web page, where you can find all the activities we're doing, and the webinars that are upcoming, and find also our newsletter that it's with full of stories about how private conservation is doing around the world. Okay, so thank you very much. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Bye-bye.
Thank you,
Have a
panelists.
nice
Thank you
day.
again.
Yes.
Thanks, everybody.